enjoy parenting. As is our practice, we're going to start by talking about things that have been on our minds lately in regard to parenting. And I'm going to raise a topic that I know in advance is far too substantial for us to make much headway on here. But it's a topic I find really fascinating. I know you, Kyle, will have a lot to say about it. So I'll raise it here, and perhaps it'll become a theme that we can come back to in weeks to come. So the topic is, first of all, there have been some themes that have been emerging in our conversations. Themes like it's not so much, parenting is not so much about rules. It's more about your relationship with your child, the importance of being a role model to your child, and the fact that your position as role model has a much greater influence on them than direct advice that you might give them. The importance of being your child's kind of partner and partner and ally as opposed to adversary.
Yeah.
So all of these themes are things that seem to recur in a lot of our discussion and in a lot of our advice. And then I was introduced to a book by my husband just recently, and I've only read the first almost 2 chapters, but it has a fascinating premise that made me realize there is a presumption in all of that advice. And the presumption is that your child has an attachment to you, such that they take your position as role model, your relationship with them, your approval and guidance, that they take all that seriously. Mm-hmm. And the thesis of this book is that sort of attachment, that kind of mooring with the parents has been lost, and that what kids today are doing is substituting peer relationships for their parental relationships in their seeking of guidance and identity and mooring. I find that really fascinating. I think there's a lot that we could integrate in our observations about parenting and about culture and about school culture that goes along with this. And I definitely, in reflecting on my own relationship with my kids, see certain advantages I've had that have allowed me to create the sort of relationship with them that makes them turn to me for that sort of guidance, as opposed to turning to peers. I feel like there are conditions in my life in particular that have made that easier for me than they might be broadly culturally. And that's one of the aspects I think we could talk about. So first of all, does that thesis sound plausible and interesting to you, that kids in general are turning more towards peers for their identity and guidance than they are to their parents? And then we could talk about what if you agree that there's some plausibility to that premise, we could talk about what might be some of the forces of culture that are contributing to that phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, it definitely sounds plausible to me. Based on the short description that you gave, I'm wondering, is this thesis that the attachment parents have with children or children have to parents is like the primary means that parenting happens in, like that's the avenue that child rearing is happening in, and it's emulation to them? And then also it sounds like it's an either or thing. I smell a false dichotomy there.
Yeah.
So
I will put on the record already that I have some skepticism about the book because of this kind of either or thinking, and because I'm suspicious of any book that immediately lays out suicide statistics and school violence statistics to validate their point. And this one does that. So it's as if they have to go to our deepest, darkest fears to convince us that there's any plausibility to their theory, and that already is off-putting to me. So I do have some suspicions about it, but it still raises a really, really interesting issue that I definitely see truth and plausibility to in my experiences, and that I think the way schools approach the whole kind of structure and culture of schools would help emphasize that attachment as opposed to a parental attachment.
Yeah. I just have to cut in. It's a minor point, but you and I have seen this for at least a decade. People saying like, here's the problem. and look, it leads to suicide.
Yeah.
I just think that because there's been an uptick in suicide over the past 10, 20 years among teens, you can look at any cultural trend and say, look, they correlate. And
Right.
so this is not to say that suicide is unimportant or that the problems that they're trying to pick on are not real. It's just, it's a weak argument, and it's going to numb people to suicide statistics. And you can make a much better case than just, look, it's scary suicide, but we don't need to get bogged down in that. It's just a pet peeve of mine and yours, I think.
So if we just want to look for what is the plausibility in this theory and is there any truth to it, one of the first things that occurs to me is the readily available access kids have to their peers constantly on a moment-to-moment basis. So if they're thinking through something at home, or they're seeking validation in some form, or they're seeking stimulation in some form, they can pull out their phone, and they always have direct, immediate access to their peers. And that sort of breaks down any sort of sanctity to home life separate from peers. That's one thing that occurred to me. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that that's a trend that could fit into this. Also, the fact that schools over the past generation or two have come to take on more of the roles that were traditionally occupied by parents. One thing that makes our school, VanDamme, so unique is that we just care about the academics. Like, that's not literally true. We care about the children as well, but that's the role that we want to occupy in their life, is stupendous academics. We're not also trying to explicitly develop their character and their career prospects and all these other things that that schools are taking on more and more roles. And the more space that they take in the child's life, including, you know, their nutrition and their exercise and their spiritual growth and their moral growth, that's by nature, it's going to be zero sum. They're subtracting the role that parents play in all of that. So
Right.
and
I'll add to that, even the volume of homework, the way that school sort of overtakes their life at home too can have that effect. So by trying to address all aspects of childhood within the school, it's creating a rivalry with parent life. And then by consuming their hours after school too, it exacerbates that problem.
Yeah, so the schoolwork is filling up the home time, and then the home domestic responsibilities are filling up the school time. So it both serve to rob the family and the parent of what would be their more traditional role. And then also, I don't know the statistics very well on this, but there has been an increase in how many families have two wage earners instead of one. The demands on people's time, like the number of hours they're working in the office. I don't know if it's gone up, but I wouldn't surprise me if parents just have less time to dedicate to the attachment and the bond that they have with their kids. So I'm on board for the plausibility of it. Where do you want to go here?
I think the thing that gave it the most plausibility to me, and that is the biggest a topic here too big to take on, there seems to me to be a general breakdown in the idea that adults ought to be guides and mentors to children at all. And we could point to countless reasons for that phenomenon. But let's say pedagogically, the attitude of the teacher as the guide on the side, as opposed to the sage on the stage. You know, there are past practices that we're rebelling against and that were misguided and problematic that make us culturally make us embrace that sort of attitude. But I feel able to kind of scan my mind and my experience and think about all the ways that adults used to have a very important role as, you know, the wiser, more experienced, more mature forces in a child's life who are going to instill them with the values that they have had the experience to develop. And that phenomenon in general seems more and more absent from our culture and kids' experiences.
Yeah. Well, you know, like so many problems that we see in education and in parenting, we can trace it back to Rousseau, his model of the child being born sort of like as a perfect flower that just needs to unfold unmolested, that you just need to arrange things perfectly around them so that they can just manifest themselves. There hasn't really been a big compelling alternative to that in Western intellectual tradition since Rousseau. And you can kind of draw an intellectual line from the trends that we're talking about all the way back to there.
Yeah. Well, I did, of course, immediately think of Alan Bloom. You and I and some other staff members read The Closing of the American Mind as a book group a few years ago. And his point that there are many traditions that we discarded and rebelled against that importantly had to be discarded and rebelled against. But if what you're left with is a cultural void and vacuum where there are no traditions to depend on and no principles to pass along from generation to generation, then we've got a problem as serious as having problematic versions of those principles. So yeah,
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Are we trying to just kind of take this idea and run with it, or can I ask you some questions about what you've read so far and see it?
Sure. So I haven't gotten to anything in the book about their theories of what it is about culture that's caused this detachment from parents as the role. So we'll have to come back to that when I've gotten farther along in the book. But yeah, what is your question?
Well, so my question was, at first glance, you can understand, if kids are just going to other kids for guidance, you can very easily imagine how that could go awry.
The blind leading the blind.
Yeah, but are there any specifics that are mentioned in what the damage is that's caused by that, by kids when they have trouble, they just go to their peer group instead of going to anyone with experience?
So not a lot yet, but I'll give you one that seems fairly key to this. When you go to your peers for your sense of mooring and your for your sort of validation and sense of identity and all that, you don't have unconditional love. When you go to your parents, you do, if proper, if that term is used properly. Right. So it makes the thing you're turning to as your anchor something that doesn't anchor very well, and that's very volatile and unpredictable and can turn at any moment. So that's one of the keys, is that there's something unique about the parent-child relationship, even outside. So there's the fact of the parent being mature, the obvious fact of the parent being ideally mature and able to give guidance, and the child unable to provide that role. But there's also just the sheer nature of the relationship and the security and bond that come from that distinct relationship that you can't count on when you're dealing with peers. Yeah,
it sounds like you're turning to Twitter for consistency and support. If you're relying on the peer group.
Right.
When was this book? Do you know the copyright or roughly when it was published?
I don't. I think it's
pretty modern.
Book. Yeah.
It makes me think of a phenomenon that you and I have talked a lot about. We were both enamored with Theranos and the Fire Festival. And we both looked at each other and said, how did these people not just walk down the street to the New York Times and say what was happening? But if you are in this mindset, not that you have this solid moral mooring, that's a weird that something that you can depend on, despite the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, that firmness of the parental bond and the family bond. If you're just depending on your peer group for your moral centering, then it's much harder to say, hey, this is a big scam that I'm a part of. This is a trap. And it leaves you more, like as you were describing the kids that are dealing with, that are turning to a fickle peer group to find their moral center, that made me think of, it seems like a few jumps away from cancel culture on Twitter, but just at a smaller scale. So, yeah.
Okay. So as I expected, that took up a lot of time and didn't leave you much time for your
I'm sure
issue of the day.
the
Yeah.
title. What's the title?
Oh, it's called Hold On to Your Kids.
Hold on to your kids. All right.
Hold On to Your
Well,
Kids. So I'll keep you posted
okay.
whether I find it more persuasive or less as we go along. But it definitely, inevitably, it's going to have the value of raising these questions that you and I can talk about, even if I don't come to agree with their thesis.
Well, it's interesting that you're bringing this up because my question is social related. And this one is less I have a point to make, more that I've got a question I'm working on as a parent.
Okay.
The short version and inaccurate version is I'm worried because my son Isaac is shy. But that's not actually accurate because
Yeah.
you and I both know shyness is not a sin. It's
Mhm.
not something to worry about. It's more that I'm worried that the way I've got his childhood set up right now is not going to give him enough social. He's not being fed enough social experiences. Partly it's COVID that made it really hard for my wife and I to make bonds with new parents, parents with kids. So we're kind of a few steps behind because of that. And then just the accidents of chance. We don't have a lot of friends with kids our age. And then the jobs that we have make it a bit hard to make new friends that are that have kids about Isaac's age. And so, when he goes to the park, he mostly just kind of stands and watches kids and follows them around. He doesn't talk. He doesn't interact with them. Like he did it a little bit last weekend when we took him to a pumpkin patch, and my wife and I almost started singing because there's just this. He loves pretty little girls. So there's a pretty little girl that came over to play, and he wanted to take her over to a little water park thing. So that's the thing that I'm grappling with. And the thing I'm having a hard time figuring out is, am I overreacting? Is this just a phase that will pass with time? Or do I need to try to put an effort into, getting him around more kids? I don't really know how to find the dividing line for that. So I'm just curious to get your first impressions of that.
Yeah, my first thought is that in my experience, both with my own kids and at school, I see very little correlation between whether the child is outgoing and social and makes friends at the park and what their previous cultural experience was, whether they were in school, whether they're around kids a lot. So that's just my observation from experience, that's not the primary causal factor. And therefore, I personally wouldn't worry about too much orchestrating circumstances that might help him develop those social relationships, because it's a weird comparison, but I sort of think of it as in the same category as homework in this sense. Parents are always asking me, if you don't give homework, how are the kids going to be able to manage homework when they get to high school? And I always tell them that's not a specific skill they need training for. They need general maturity. They need to take their success seriously. That needs to be a real goal of theirs. If they have those qualities, they'll be fine and they'll get their homework done. And I feel the same is true of making friends and being social. If he has a happy, supportive, warm environment with you in the home and with his caretaker and with whatever other people come in and out of his life, I think those experiences are going to give him all the skills he needs to be social when the social opportunities arise. And that the shyness that you're perceiving doesn't actually indicate anything about any specific training that he might need.
Yeah. And, we talk about this perspective a lot, that a lot of these things are just phases, that they're just developmental. There's not a lot that requires direct instruction, but it's just hard. Like those worries, they sneak up on you when you're not careful.
Well, I want to remind you of this story. I don't know if you remember this, but when my eldest daughter, Lana, was in preschool, so I put her, she was obviously shy from a very young age. She started preschool at 2.5, so about Isaac's age now. She started preschool. She was in a social environment, and she would talk to nobody, sing nothing at circle time, never interact with the other kids, never participate in any way. She was a silent presence in the classroom. Then one day I came to pick her up and she was sitting in a circle, and the little girl sitting next to her leaned over and whispered something in her ear. And I was like, oh, social interaction. I was so happy. And Lana came out of class and I said, what did that little girl say to you? And she said, don't sit so close to me. That was the first exciting social interaction I had witnessed. I thought it was hilarious. Fortunately, I didn't freak out about this and think she's permanently scarred by it. But that was her personality. In a sense, it still is her personality, and it brings challenges, but it brings immense rewards too. I just found a beautiful quote by G.K. Chesterton on the value of being shy. So I'll send that to you later for reassurance. I know we have a guest waiting for us, so should we invite him in now? Okay. I think we have, yes, here we go. If that's our guest name, I'm going to need some help.
Yep. Hello, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Hi.
How are you doing?
So what is your name?
My name is Natan.
Natan. Hi.
And Abigail, my partner, she's right next to me, but she's
putting a baby to sleep.
Oh, hi.
Great. Hi.
So we're very glad to be here. We're enjoying this podcast very much. So thank you for having this series. So our question really kind of connects from the opposite end of what you were saying. So basically, I want to know what is the right age to send the child to daycare or preschool. So I have this objectivist friend, and he told me right before we sent the child to daycare, he said that he heard Peikoff in a Q&A. He was asked about this question, and then he said that when the child is at home, leaving the child at home as much as possible, he basically he's the center of the attention. He gets all the focus that he needs. He's confident, so that gives him the time to kind of get a reality first mentality, the reality exists kind of metaphysics. And then if you send him too early, so he might get the social metaphysics mentality. So I mean, he's he needs to kind of compete for attention with the caretaker, and he's competing for over the toys with the other children, and that could maybe cause him stress. I don't know if that's what Peikoff said. I'm just this is my own, and then that may instill in him the social metaphysics that society is there first and only then reality. So I'm starting with the abstract, and then maybe we can get into more details of our personal situation. But
so the idea is you've heard from Peikoff that when the child is alone with the parents, that reality becomes a primary concern because there's not a lot of other people around. But then in a daycare setting with a larger group of kids, people become the primary focus. And the concern is that being in a more people-saturated environment might lead to more social metaphysics as mental habit. Is that a good summary of what you're saying?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Well, I would want to ask Peikoff some more questions about that, because my understanding is, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but every kid's a social metaphysician. That they don't know what's going on. They hear a loud noise. They don't know how to evaluate it. They look at your face to figure out if it's scary or not. A stranger comes up to them. They don't know how to evaluate if it's to be trusted or not. And they look to the people that they trust to figure that out. So that being said, this is not me saying like, throw the kid in with whoever you want to. It doesn't matter whatsoever. But that I think that there can be good and bad. It really depends on the daycare environment. That if you're sending them to an environment that is just not that wholesome, that is, I don't know. I'm trying to think of what could the most corrupt daycare I could imagine that would inculcate like let's all vote on, I don't know, who's good and who's bad or something like. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what a more corrupt daycare would look like. I could imagine a daycare that isn't having the right impact on your child, but I don't think that being around a large number of kids as such would always be harmful. But Lisa, do you have an opinion on that?
No, that was my first reaction too, is that nothing about the child's worldview seems inherent in, are they in a daycare center, or are they with parents? I don't think there's anything about the sheer fact of there being a number of children around them that's going to affect their worldview. It's all going to be about the quality of the environment they're in. So I think, and I just have to voice a little bit of resistance at the idea of trying to project what their, future worldview and overall philosophy of life is going to be as a consequence of those sorts of decisions that you make. If I send them to daycare, this is what's going to happen. It's almost too global a way of looking at it. And I think you said we can get into the concretes of your specific. I think looking at it more narrowly will actually help you to make better judgments for them, rather than allowing these fears of like intangible, huge, major consequences to their psyche that you can't see, but maybe they're lurking there in the experience. I think if I were making that decision when to send them, a lot of that's going to be dictated by your personal practical circumstances. Sometimes both parents have to work. The overall well-being of your family depends on you both working, and you have to seek childcare. Maybe you can hire a nanny. Maybe a nanny is prohibitively expensive and you have to go to daycare. And all these things, I think, are very personal decisions that will involve the global well-being of your family. And then once you make that decision, yes, I think it's important to look at the daycare and look at your child's experience there and say, does their experience here, is it consistent with my best understanding of what's actually healthy and a happy experience for my child? So I always tell people in regard to schools, get into the school, observe, see how the kids are interacting, see how the adults are interacting with the children, and make your best judgment whether that accords with your own values and your own desires for your child. And I would say the same of daycare. If you can do as much observing of the actual experience of the child as you can, and then make your best judgment. Does this fit with what I want for my kid and how I want my child to be treated and what I want their social experiences to be? And if it doesn't, sometimes radical changes are necessary. But I would start with that sort of approach, taking the overall well-being of your family seriously, and then looking at the specific situations and opportunities, rather than feeling like there might be some rule for their experience that you need to happen upon. And if you don't, they're going to be permanently damaged in some major way.
I think in our personal case, it was kind of a really slow, gradual process of having him adjust to the daycare. We're fairly we're happy with the daycare. I think we can say that. We do trust the people there, and they seem to be having the right approach that we were looking for. So that's good. It's just that for him it was he was like 1.5, and he just started having abandonment fears. It just felt like it was the worst time to send him in.
And he also just had a brother. Born, which
so those transitions are inevitable and normal and healthy, and so expecting transition seems important, not feeling like you've failed him because there's an adjustment process, but watching him carefully. And if it's a transition that's not temporary, for one thing, if it's not something that he does adjust to and seems to be happily adjusting to, then I would take more seriously. And also, how do the caregivers help him through that transition is a really important thing to look at. So if you feel like, yes, he's going through some stress over separating from mom and that's added to a little sibling. Okay. Yeah. Those are things you want to pay attention to. But how are the adults helping him through that? And do you see progress in him making that adjustment? And does he seem happy overall? And if it seemed like it was deeply traumatic and progress was not being made, then I would say, absolutely don't force it. You got to look for another solution because this is clearly not healthy and working for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because now that on the flip side, there's starting to be progress, and I mean, the last few days he was there like the whole day.
Yeah.
And now it's hard for us.
Yeah, so now we're like trying to have projections. Like, is it okay that he's adjusting? I mean,
does he not need us anymore?
Yeah, like he doesn't love us anymore. Like, what's going?
Welcome to parenthood.
This is kind of superficial, but the first, several days he was there, the first few weeks, they would send us pictures from the daycare. And you'd always see him in the background, and he's just playing with his own toys. And the other kids, they're sitting in front of the teacher, and they're like listening and attentive. And I'm like, yeah, good for you. Don't conform. And now that I saw him, so now recently he's just sitting with the others, and I'm like, oh, what's going on? Are they making you like, part of the system?
No, so you heard this thing from Dr. Peikoff, which I'd like to hear it for myself, so I could hear exactly.
I did not hear it myself. I heard
right. So we got this secondhand from Dr. Peikoff, and now it's a narrative that you're imposing on all of his experiences. So let's get rid of that narrative and just maybe independently look at his health for ourselves and see how you think he's actually doing in these circumstances.
Did you want to add anything? Or? Oh, sorry.
No, just thank you. We really, really enjoy listening to you, and it's been really helpful.
I'm so glad, and I hope you'll come back again sometime. It was a pleasure. And I think we're going to move over to Clubhouse now for anybody who wants to continue the conversation in a way that allows us to interact a little more openly. So I'll see everybody over there.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Thank you, Natan.